Okay. Boker Tov. Good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
I'll begin with actually relating to the title I gave to the shiur, Relative Kedusha of Mikdash, Yerushalayim, and Wall Cities. The word relative can be understood in two ways. They clearly come from the same source and interact, but one aspect of relative can be proportionate. When my granddaughter tells me that she's a big girl because she's 3 years old now, and her brother is a little boy because he was born only 3 weeks ago, that's in relative terms, because when I compare it to myself, they're both very little children. So there's a relative aspect, which is an aspect of proportion. But there's also another dimension of relative, in the sense of how we relate to a parent, a child, a sibling. We're related. And in this case, I purposely use the term relative because the shiur will focus on both aspects. I won't necessarily point out this is this, that's that, but in your minds keep the idea that relative is both an issue of the relationship between Mikdash, Yerushalayim, and Arei Choma, and also an issue of proportionate Kedusha. When we come to deal with the aspects of Kedusha, one of the central sources are the Mishnayot in the first parak of Kelim. Those you have before you, Shnan Kelim, parak Aleph, Mishnayot, Vav through Tet. Let's begin to look at some of these Mishnayot. Mishnah Vav. Eser Kedushotin. There are 10 levels of Kedusha. Already telling us that there is issue of relativity, proportionate relativity, when speaking about Kedusha. Eretz Yisrael mekudeshet mikol ha'aratzot. Eretz Yisrael has a Kedusha that differs it from all other lands in the world. Umahi Kedushata. In what way is this Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael over other lands expressed? Shemevi'im imena ha'omer v'habikurim u'shtei halechem. Because from Eretz Yisrael we bring the Omer, for the Korban HaOmer on Pesach, the Bikurim, the fruit, the first grown fruit which we bring to the Mikdash, the Bikurim, Ushtei Halechem, the 2 loaves of bread that were brought on Shavuot. Mashein mevi'im mikol ha'aratzot. These things are not brought from other lands, only from Eretz Yisrael. In reference to Bikurim, there's somewhat of a discussion. We're not going to get into that, but just be aware that there's somewhat of a discussion. If anybody's ever heard, waiting, maybe Bikurim can be brought from here, from there. The Mefarshim discuss it here. The next level of Kedusha is found in Mishnah Zayin. Ayarot hamukafot choma mekudashot mimena. A greater level of Kedusha than the rest of Eretz Yisrael are the walled cities. Shemeshalchim mitochan et hametzoraim. A person who has the affliction of tzara'at, may not remain in the walled city, and he's sent to sit outside the city. ומסבבין לתוכה מת עד שירצו, יצא אין מחזירים אותו. Should somebody in a walled city die, you may carry him throughout the streets of the city. Have a levaya which travels through the different streets, allowing the many people who respected this person show their respect. However, once the body leaves the walls of the walled city, it may not be returned or brought into the walled city. Mishnah Chet leads us to the next level of Kedusha. Lifnim min hachoma mekudash mehem. Inside the choma. Now, obviously, we just spoke about the walled cities, and the walled cities are not defined by the outside, because we saw that with the dead body that is taken out and cannot be brought in. So, what is it that we're talking about here inside the choma? The answer is rather simple. If you will turn for a moment to the second side of that page, to the Perush HaMishnah of the Rambam, he says, Pnim min hachoma, hakavana lechomat Yerushalayim. Pnim hachoma here refers to the choma, the wall of Yerushalayim. Namely, in Mishnah Chet, we've moved on from the other walled cities to Yerushalayim, and says the Mishnah, Mekudeshet mimena. It, in other words, the area of inside the walls of Yerushalayim, the city of Yerushalayim, has a greater Kedusha than the other walled cities. In what way is this Kedusha expressed? She'ochlim sham kodshim kalim u'maaser sheni. Because one can eat the meat of korbanot that are defined as kodshim kalim. Within the sacrifices, within the korbanot, there's a distinction of kodshei kodshim, which includes all the chatat, the ashams. Those are eaten only by the kohanim and within the parameters of the Mikdash. However, kodshim kalim, that could be all the shlamim, korbanot toda, bechor. Okay, bechor is eaten by the kohen, but it can be eaten within Yerushalayim. Therefore, it's a kodshim kalim. Maser, right? Korban Pesach, probably the most familiar with. All those are eaten outside of the Mikdash, or can be eaten outside of the Mikdash, as long as they're eaten within the walls of Yerushalayim. Similarly, the Maaser Sheni is also eaten in Yerushalayim, inside the walls, and may not be eaten outside the walls of Yerushalayim. Har habayit mekudash mimenu. A greater level of Kedusha is that of Har habayit, even though it's within the walls of Yerushalayim. She'ein zavim v'zavot nidot v'yoldot nichnasim l'sham. Because there it is prohibited not only for the Mitzoraim that we spoke about earlier in Ayarot Mukafot Choma, which apply as well in Yerushalayim, and definitely in Har HaBayit, but also the Zavim and Zavot, the Nida, the Yoledet, woman within the period immediately after her birth may not enter the area of Har HaBayit because of its Kedusha. It's Har HaBayit, remember, we're talking about Har HaBayit, not where there is the structure of the Mikdash itself, but all of Har HaBayit. Just so that people get a grasp of that idea, those who have the custom of going up to Har HaBayit today from time to time will definitely refrain, we'll touch on that maybe a little later, will definitely refrain from entering the areas of the Mikdash itself, but they will walk in Har HaBayit, at least in what they have calculated and defined as clearly not part of the Mikdash itself. However, any person who goes to Har HaBayit, and it does so from a halachic perspective, is told that the prerequisite for that is tefillah, mikvah. Right? In other words, there is a certain requirement for Har HaBayit in a level of Kedusha that may not exist in reference to Yerushalayim.
It's very small what you can do when you go up there.
That's not necessarily only a function of the halachic limitations. That is also political limitations.
But that's the big difference.
Okay.
Wait,
That's not the purpose of my shiur. I leave that to others.
But that also explains the Zavim, the Zavot.
Right, because that's the same Tevilah, right. Yeah. Good. Okay. Now, I'm not going to elaborate, and that's why I put it in smaller fonts, the continuation, but just to get the feel of it. החייל מקודש ממנו, שאין עובדי כוכבים וטמא מת נכנסים לשם. עזרת נשים מקודשת ממנו. Then we start getting into the parts of the Mikdash itself. The Chayil, the Ezrat Nashim, the Azara, leading up to the Kodesh Kodashim. And each has another level of Kedusha. When we see this, in reference to our focus of discussion, we've already seen clearly that there is a distinction in the Kedusha of Mikdash, of Yerushalayim, and Arei Choma, where the least of the Kedushot is the walled cities, the Arei Choma. The next level is that of Yerushalayim, and the highest levels of Kedusha pertain to the Mikdash, each section according to its requirements. Before we continue, I'd like to just relate to a certain aspect of this. Mikdash, Yerushalayim, make up a structure that, according to some opinions, are an inherent requirement of the function of a Mikdash, being a Machane Shechina, Machane Leviyah, and Machane Yisrael. Those terms may be familiar to you in reference to the encampment in the Midbar, where the Mishkan itself was Machane Shechina. Around it were the Levim, and that area was defined as Machane Leviyah. And beyond that, where the rest of Am Yisrael lived, was Machane Yisrael. You may remember, we've read recently in Sefer Vayikra, a Metzora or a Zav are sent out from some of these machanot. The Metzora is the classic, is sent out even of Machane Yisrael. Remember the Metzora we encountered in the Mishnah? Arei Choma, Yerushalayim. Those create a Machane Yisrael. To the extent that there are those who say that the Kedusha of Arei Choma, its purpose is to create throughout the land a place that has a status of Machane Yisrael, so that there be a reality of Shiluach, sending out the Metzorah from the Machane Yisrael. And here let's go back to that Perush of the Rambam. Okay. It says the Rambam, Veda, שישראל במדבר היו 3 מעלות. In the encampment in the desert, there were 3 levels of Kedusha. Machane Yisrael, והם 4 מחנות. The Machane Yisrael that's made up of the 4 encampments according to the different tribes, right? Each 3 tribes made up a Machane. ומחנה לוויה, והוא דבר השם מסביב למשכן יחנו. Machane Leviyah is acknowledged or recognized in the Psukim by the statement of, in reference to the Levim, Usviv LaMishkan Yachanu. Levim reside around the Mishkan, creating a separate status of Kedusha. Umachane Shechina, v'hu Chatzar Ohel Moed u'ma shebetocho. And the Machane Shechina, as we explained, is the Mishkan, the Chatzer, and everything that's inside of it. Ukeneged ma'alot elu ledorot, the parallel to that, it was an intentional parallelizing. Ukeneged ma'alot elu ledorot, mipetach Yerushalayim ad har habayit Machane Yisrael. Inside the walls of Yerushalayim constitutes a Machane Yisrael, and therefore the levels of Kedusha that apply to it. ומפתח הר הבית עד פתח העזרה, כלומר שער ניקנור, מחנה לוויה. We said the Har HaBayit had a separate status of Kedusha, defines the Rambam that is the equivalent of מחנה לוויה, ומפתח העזרה ולפנים, מחנה שכינה. And beyond that, which basically refers to the structure of the Mikdash, all of it is part of the Machane Shechina. In other words, this wasn't just random. The distinction that takes place here is a halachic distinction that attempts to recreate the idea of the different machanot as they existed in the Mishkan, in the Midbar, in reference to the Mishkan. All right. Now, before we proceed to other Makorot, I'd like to raise a few questions in the context of the Mishnayot which we learned, and we'll return to answer them afterwards. The first Kedusha we mentioned here was Eretz Yisrael, and its Kedusha was expressed through Mimena, Shemevi'im Mimena HaOmer, HaBikurim, Shtei HaLechem, the bringing of the Omer, the Bikurim, Shtei HaLechem. Is that the only aspect of Eretz Yisrael? What about, at the very least, Trumot u'Masrot? Trumot u'Masrot require Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, and it's not mentioned here in the Mishnah. Why? Next, in the Arei Choma, we mention the sending of the Mitzoraim, Machane Yisrael, from which in the Midbar we find the Shilach Tamtzorah, that he's sent out from the Machane. Okay. But in this week's Parsha, we read something else about Arei Choma. If we go down right beyond the Mishnayot, there's Psukim from Vayikra. ובכל ארץ אחוזתכם גאולה תיתנו לארץ, וכי ימוך אחיך מאחוזתו ובא גואלו הקרוב אליו, וגאל את ממכר אחיו, ואיש כי לא יהיה לו גואל והשיגה ידו, ומצא כדי גאולתו, וחישב את שני ממכרו, והשיב את העודף לאיש אשר מכר לו, ושב לאחוזתו. ואם לא מצאה ידו להשיב לו, והיה ממכרו ביד הקונה אותו, עד שנת היובל, ויצא ביובל, ושב לאחוזתו. If a person sells a plot of land, that it could include a house and it could be a piece of land that is being worked agriculturally, doesn't make a difference. He has the ability, the opportunity to redeem it. Sold it for X, we calculate, okay, it was now in the hands of the buyer for 5 years. In the period between the sale and Yovel, each year gets a certain value according to what it was sold for. Therefore, we will deduct the 5 years that it was in his hand, and you have to redeem by paying the rest. But a person has that option of redeeming the land and returning it to himself. If he is unable, say the Psukim, to redeem, and there isn't someone else, another relative of his, who will help him out and redeem it for him, then it remains in the hands of the buyer, but only until Yovel. And Yovel, as I didn't bring in the Psukim here, but earlier on, it is very clear that in Yovel, the land returns to the owner. That's part of the halachot of Yovel. And it's stated here as well in Pasuk Chavchet, V'yatza bayovel v'shav la'achuzato. It will go out of the hands of the buyer and return to its rightful owners. However, in the next two psukim, we read something different. The ish ki yimkor beit moshav ir choma. Should a person sell a home, a house, in a walled city? Which is exactly what we're discussing, a walled city. V'hayta geulato ad tom shnat mimkaro yamin tiyeh geulato. A person who sold the house in a walled city can redeem that house during the year. Yamim is always a year. If you think back to the story with Rivka, where they ask for her to sit there, Chodesh or Yamim. It doesn't make sense, right? Chodesh is longer than Yamim, seemingly. No, but Yamim in the Torah language means a year. And that's what it says here, that there's Yamim. Yamim tiheh geulato. In other words, he has a year to redeem the house. The next pasuk says, "Ve'im lo yig'al ad melot lo shana tmima." If he does not redeem within that first year, "Ve'kam habayit asher ba'ir asher lo choma litzmitut לקונה אותו לדורותיו לא יצא ביובל." Torah is as clear as it can make itself. Should the person not redeem that home, that house, within the first year, then it becomes permanently in the ownership of the person who acquired it, and it does not return to its original owners in Yovel, like the previous parsha of lands and homes that are outside of the walled cities. In other words, we have here a halacha that is specific to walled cities, that the redeeming time is immediate to a year, which is also a little different than other sections of land, but primarily that if it's not redeemed, it permanently becomes the buyer's. Why is that not mentioned in the Mishnayot as a distinction between Ir Mukefet Choma, a walled city, and the rest of Eretz Yisrael.
But that law isn't necessarily related to Kedusha, it's just this is the law. I mean, the Mishnah is talking about Kedusha.
Okay. I think that you're right, and I will relate to that later. I would not completely, or I'd be careful. In the end result, I think I will get to what you're saying, but I would be careful in detaching it from an element of Kedusha. Because, at least according to some opinions, the function, the whole reality of the difference in Ir Choma stems from that unique Kedusha of Ir Choma. Okay, but I'll get to it, and you'll see that in the bottom line I'm going to say very similar to what you said.
I have a question about the original Mishnah. Maybe it's understood there, but it says it doesn't say within Israel. And we know from Purim that there are other cities outside of Israel that have Choma, and at least in Purim it may be relevant. So it's hard to imagine that, a walled city outside of Israel is more holy than one of Israel. It doesn't say it there.
You're right, except that I think the Mishnah is working on a progressive format. And therefore, once it's mentioned Eretz Yisrael in opposition to the rest of the world, so anything else is within Eretz Yisrael. And finally, even in reference to Yerushalayim, there are certain halachot. I'm not going to get into details of it, but for example, the ability to rent a house to Olei Regalim, which should not be or cannot be done. There are other halachot that pertain to the status of Yerushalayim, and again, is usually perceived as a function of its Kedusha, because again, you can argue that it's not, right? Is usually perceived as a function of its Kedusha, but are not mentioned in the Mishnayot here. Before we attempt to answer this, I'd like to lay the ground in reference to a different aspect, which will at least emphasize the possible answers that we'll suggest. And here, we move on the second page, section 2, to the Rambam in Hilchot Truma. Now, this Rambam here in the Hilchot Truma, the Truma, and in the Hilchot Beit HaBchira, is a well-known opinion of the Rambam in reference to Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. Part of what I'll say later on in reference or in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, is things that I heard from him when I was in his shiur, but are also found, at least by his Talmidim. I think there's even one place where in his own writings the general idea appears. The Rambam in Hilchot Truma says as follows: Kol shehiziku ole Mitzrayim v'nitkadesh kedusha rishona keivan shegalu batelu kedushatav. When speaking about the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael in totality, including Yerushalayim, including Rabbi at the moment, Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael in general, we speak of two stages of Kedusha. There may be more, but we usually speak of two stages, known as Kedusha Rishona, the first Kedusha, which is usually associated with the coming of the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael at the time of Yehoshua, and Kedusha Shniya, which again is usually associated to the coming to Eretz Yisrael after Galut Babel, after the 70 years that the Jews are in Galut and return. That's usually seen as Kedusha Shniya, and that's how we will relate to it. So Rambam says, any area that was held by the Olei Mitzrayim, those who entered Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua, v'nitkadesh Kedusha Rishona, and was sanctified at that time, Keivan shegalu batlu Kedushatam. When the destruction of the first Mikdash occurred, and the Jewish people went out to Galut, were exiled, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael ceases to exist. Remember, it's said here in Hilchot Truma. In other words, this is being said in the context of the requirement of Hilchot Trumot u'Masrot. שקדושה ראשונה לפי שהייתה מפני הכיבוש בלבד, קידשה לשעתה ולא קידשה לעתיד לבוא. Since the first Kedusha was established on the conquering of the land, that is a sort of temporary kind of Kedusha because it could be overturned. You conquered the land, now somebody else conquers the land from you. Your conquering no longer has any significance, any meaning. כיוון שעלו בני הגולה והחזיקו במקצת הארץ, when the exiled people returned to Eretz Yisrael and hold part of the land. Again, for our purpose, it's not going to be that significant, but it is significant in the Rambam's whole context, in the whole halachic context, because not all the lands that were conquered and belonged to Am Yisrael during Beit Rishon, or period preceding that, were resettled during Beit Sheni. But those areas that the returning Jews take hold of, החזיקו במקצת הארץ, קידשוה כקדושה שנייה, העומדת לעולם לשעתה ולעתיד לבוא. This Kedusha is eternal. And this Kedusha does not cease to exist even when there's a destruction, a Churban Habayit, and even when the Jews are exiled from Eretz Yisrael. This Kedusha stands.
Why? That sounds counterintuitive.
Excellent question. Excellent question. Why?
Sounds counterintuitive.
I don't know if counterintuitive, but the why I think stands here very strongly. Okay. Excellent question. We'll get to it. The Rambam in Hilchot Beit HaBchira makes a different distinction. In Halacha Yudalet he writes, Kol makom shelo na'asa b'chol elu chaseder hazeh ein kiddush gamur. So in the previous halachot he spoke about how the Mikdash is given Kedusha, the process or the expansion of. Those who are learning Daf Yomi may remember about a week ago you learned about the issue of the Shtei Chalot, the going outside the walls, inside the walls. There's a process that's found in Masechet Shavuot. And then he continues. I'm skipping the small font. ובמה נתקדשה בקדושה ראשונה שקידשה שלמה, שהוא קידוש העזרה בירושלים לשעתן וקידשן לעתיד לבוא. Says the Rambam that the Kedusha of Mikdash takes place with the building of the first Mikdash by Shlomo. He sanctified the Azara, the Yerushalayim, and that Kedusha exists from then on eternally. In other words, when we speak about the Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shniya, and Kedusha Rishona ceases to exist, and only Kedusha Shniya goes on, says the Rambam, that applies only to areas of Eretz Yisrael outside of Yerushalayim. The sanctity, the Kedusha of Yerushalayim and Mikdash exists from the time of Shlomo, because before that it did not receive this Kedusha. The time of Shlomo it receives this Kedusha. Okay, we're going to skip, for now at least, the Ravid, and move on to we'll quickly read Halacha Tetvav. לפיכך מקריבים הקורבנות כולם, אף על פי שאין שם בית בנוי, ואוכלים קודשי קודשים בכל העזרה, אף על פי שהיא חריבה, ואינה מוקפת במחיצה, ואוכלים קודשים קלים ומעשר שני בכל ירושלים, אף על פי שאין שם חומות, שהקדושה הראשונה קידשה לשעתה וקידשה לעתיד לבוא. In other words, in very generalistic terms I'm saying at the moment, don't catch me on details, what the Rambam is saying is that the process of bringing korbanot can continue even though the Mikdash has been destroyed and even though the walls of Yerushalayim were torn down, because the Kedusha, it doesn't tell us exactly what has to be done here, but because the Kedusha exists, the possibility of bringing korbanot and eating kodshim kalim in Yerushalayim continues to exist. And then we move on to Halacha Tetzayin. That's the second page. ולמה אני אומר במקדש וירושלים קדושה הראשונה קידשה לעתיד לבוא, ובקדושת שאר ארץ ישראל לעניין שביעית ומעשרות וכיוצא בהם לא קידשה לעתיד לבוא. Says the Rambam, wait a second. Now you might ask me, why is it that in Hilchot Trumot I told you that the Kedusha of Yoshua ceases to exist at the time of the destruction of the Mikdash and the exile? But when we talk about Mikdash and Yerushalayim, Kedusha remains. There can be a complete destruction. There can be rubble all over. Kedusha continues. What's the difference? There's this act of Kedusha, there's that act of Kedusha. Either the destruction eliminates the Kedusha or doesn't. Says the Rambam, לפי שקדושת המקדש וירושלים מפני השכינה ושכינה אינה בטלה. והרי הוא אומר, והשימותי את מקדשיכם. והשימותי, and still it's מקדשיכם. Says the Rambam as follows. The source of the Kedusha, the way the Kedusha is created is different. The Kedusha of Mikdash is simply created by the fact that the Shechina settles in. In other words, what does Shlomo do here? He goes through a certain process, korbanot and so on, but basically doing is he invites the Shechina now to reside in this Mikdash that he built. Once the Shechina resides there, once HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses and comes and resides there, nothing can remove him. You can technically destroy the physical building, but you cannot remove Kadosh Baruch Hu.
I don't remember, I think Pascal who actually saw the image of the Shekhinah going up and going out. So saw that image.
There's a lot of sources of Kadosh Baruch Hu going out to exile with Am Yisrael. So let me ask you like this. Okay, so let me ask you like this. There's a shul here, right? A little further away, there's another shul called Ramban, and a lot of other shuls that you could find around here. And we say that all these shuls have Kedusha. That when you daven, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is shul. How's that possible? Because that's a Kadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is able to simultaneously be present in one place, yet not remove his Shechina from somewhere else. In Har Sinai, Kadosh Baruch Hu comes, but he also removes his Shekhinah. He clearly says, I remove my Shekhinah, then you can go up on the mountain. In Mikdash, that's why the Rambam brings this pasuk, Vashimoti Mikdashichem, that I will create that destruction, Mikdashichem, but it still will be sanctified because I will still remain there. In other words, what we say about HaKadosh Baruch Hu leaving is not that he completely detaches himself, but that he leaves in a symbolic way to join Am Yisrael or things like that. Yeah. Okay? I stopped you in the middle, so.
I mean, I just, it's not the same. There are shuls all over the world, and we think the Shekhinah is in the shul all over the world. It's not saying that it's the same as the Beit HaMikdash.
No, it just says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can simultaneously have his Shekhinah in different places. So when he
was destroyed, it removes. I mean, not.
no, that's what the Rambam says is not true. That's exactly what the Rambam is saying is not true.
So why do we go up to Harabayit with other issues? The fact that we still hold that we don't go up to Harabayit. That's touchy. That's getting it too touchy because
There's still a Shekhinah.
the Rabbi doesn't hold that.
Was to reassure Am Yisrael, but
He's with him. Right. That's what I said. It's a different expression of.
this Shekhinah here is not there.
Right.
But
One second.
removal
Yeah.
of the Shekhinah, a lot of-
One second, one at a time.
But don't we say that the Shekhinah was not in by Sheni?
Yeah.
No, we do not say that Shekhinah was not in Beit Sheni. We do not say that Shekhinah was not in Beit. There were aspects missing by Sheni. We can have the Aron, but the Shekhinah was Shoreh in Mikdash. We do not say that the
I had the same question.
Okay, so that's a return. You return completely with the building of the Mikdash. But that doesn't mean that Kadosh Baruch Hu is not there. In other words, again, it's that
he's there. Why do we need him to return?
because the return is a question of level. In other words, Kadosh Baruch Hu is there. The Kedusha is there. However, there's no question that there's a certain completeness when there's a Mikdash, when there's a function of the. Today we don't even have the avodah, even though the Rambam says technically maybe we could, but we don't have that avodah. All those things are expressed in the shul. It's not.
We're talking about the intensity of the Shekhinah?
Yeah. The intensity, the completeness of its expression. Yes.
Well, I had the same question he did, but to carry that a little further, we're talking about the presidency. Do we still have the Kedusha on Harabayit, in the Mikdash, where the area was? Other than the secular authorities saying no, why don't we do Korban Pesach?
Okay. Again, being that that's not the topic of the shiur, I'm not going to get into details, but there are other problems in the fulfillment. Okay? First of all, there are those who will argue and say that it's only political. Otherwise, we could do it today. Okay? There's still certain hurdles that need to be overcome. Okay? At the very least, okay, issues of Tuma and Tahara, even though Korban Tzibur is Dochui, B'Tzibur, but there are problems identifying a Kohen. Who is a Kohen who can do the Avodah? Do we really know? Can we really depend? There are other issues that.
Have the issue of Hara Adumah, so we need that as well.
Fine, that's a part of the Tuma. Okay, there are issues that, again, you could argue and possibly overcome, but there are even halachic issues that have to be contended with, and that's why I said the Rambam doesn't get into the details of when and how and what conditions it can be done. Yes.
I want to point out that in the time when Yechezkel was a little boy, there was a so-called prophet named Hananiah who claimed that the temple could never be destroyed because of the Shekhinah. So Yechezkel's nevuah was to show that this Hananiah was wrong. The temple
Will destroy. Okay. Now, I continue. Aval. Okay, the bold letters. Aval. Chiyuv haaretz b'shvi'it u'b'ma'asrot eino ela mipnei shu kibush rabim. However, the kibush haaretz, the chiyuv of Trumot u'masrot, that's a function of conquering וכיוון שנלקחה הארץ מידיהם, בטל הכיבוש ונפטרה מן התורה, ממעשות ומשביעית, שהרי אינה מן ארץ ישראל. Shechina cannot be undone, and it's a Kadosh Baruch Hu decision if he wants to be there or not. Our human conquering can be countered. And since the power of the Kedusha stems from our conquering, therefore, when we lose that hold, then the Kedusha dissipates. וכיוון שעלה עזרא וקידשה, לא קידשה בכיבוש, אלא בחזקה שהחזיקו בה. לפיכך, כל מקום שהחזיקו בה עולי בבל ונתקדש בקדושת עזרא השנייה, הוא מקודש היום. ואף על פי שנלקח הארץ ממנו וחייב בשביעית ובמעשות על דרך שביארנו בהלכות תרומה. Here he relates to what he said in Hilchot Truma, and he says, the first Kedusha was based on conquering. The second Kedusha is not a conquering. It is what he calls Chazaka. And that Chazaka is something that cannot be undone. That is why in Hilchot Truma he said the first Kedusha was wiped out, while the second Kedusha is not wiped out. Okay, so what is this Chazaka? What is this power of Chazaka? The Rambam solves his problem. He was a pre-Brisker, and he said, okay, I'll put things into categories. There's Chazaka and there's Kibush. I've solved my problem.
Why didn't they have Chazaka after Kibush?
Oh, wait, we'll get to that. You in the Kesef Mishnah. Okay. Kesef Mishnah asks exactly that question. One sec. Let me try to first explain what's going on here. What is this Kibush and Chazaka? So Kibush, we understand what it is. We read Sefer Yoshua, and we read they conquered the land. Okay, it continues afterwards for a while as well. What is Chazaka? Here, there are two approaches to explain this strength of Chazaka. One approach is that the Chazaka in Eretz Yisrael, how did they get to settle in Eretz Yisrael? They received permission from the monarchy, from Umot HaOlam. They received permission to settle, and once they implemented that right to settle, nobody can afterwards come and take it away from them. This was a recognized right of the Jewish people. The Havdil, UN, 1948, 1947, Declaration of the State of Israel, which is recognized by the UN. The world that recognized it. And there are a lot of people who are trying today to undermine that. And the answer is you can't. It was recognized.
It is international law.
What? Because
it is based on international law. It's recognized.
Okay. So that's one approach of understanding the issue of Chazaka. Okay? The other approach is what Rav Soloveitchik wanted to suggest. Soloveitchik says, Rambam is saying this in the same context of his Kedushat Mikdash in Yerushalayim. What occurs in Mikdash in Yerushalayim is the investment of Shechina. And that's the source of its Kedusha. And that Kedusha cannot be removed because it's based on Kadosh Baruch Hu. Suggested Rav Soloveitchik that the Chazaka is actually an extension of that Kedushat HaShechina. In other words, the Kedushat HaShechina that exists in Mikdash and Yerushalayim is what carries over and gives the Kedusha of the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Kedusha Rishona was not based on that. And therefore, it can be turned over. Kedusha Shniya is based on that. And there are different ways how this can be understood. One suggestion is that if you think of, in very general terms, of how the return to Beit Sheni took place, the initial focus is on building the Mikdash, rebuilding the Mikdash, and therefore also Yerushalayim. Only afterwards, once that is achieved, with a lot of hardship, is there a broadening of the settling in the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Now, obviously, historically, it's not 100% accurate, but there is, again and again, that focus of coming to Yerushalayim. Everybody's efforts are on building the Mikdash. That's the focus, and then we move on to the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Once we've built Yerushalayim, then we move on with that same Kedusha onto Eretz Yisrael. Another approach is, at least when I was in the Shiur, this is what Rav Soloveitchik suggested, was that there is this concept, I skipped it earlier, there's this concept of Ezra having gone with this whole process that I mentioned in Shavuot of giving Kedusha, extending the Kedusha of Harabait and so on, that he did that. So Soloveitchik suggested that Ezra did that not only in Yerushalayim, but he did that in all of Eretz Yisrael as a symbolic statement of the extension of the Kedushat HaShechina. And therefore, once it becomes part of Kedushat HaShechina, it cannot be turned over. Yeah.
Maybe I'm missing a step, but you said the Shechina stays on Harabait whether or not there's a Mikdash. You said that the Kedusha of all of Eretz Yisrael is stemming, well, this is my question, is stemming from the Kedusha of the Harabait.
Right. It's not like a lower level, but an extension of it.
You also said that the Kedusha of in the beginning, in the Mishnah, the Kedusha of the rest of Eretz Yisrael is like taken away once the Mikdash is destroyed. So if
no, Mishnah didn't say that.
No.
Mishnah just said it's different. The Mishnah talked about it's different. I said that the Rambam brings it down. No, it's less, right? But so is Yerushalayim less than Harabait.
Okay, but if the Shechina is saying whether or not there's a Mikdash, so where you said, when I challenged that, you said the Kedusha of the Harabait, that the Shechina is still there, even though there's no Mikdash. But why does the rest of Israel...
So let's go back to Halacha... Halacha Yudalid, okay? And in the second line of bold print, okay, in the second line of bold print, he says, "Uvamen itkadsha b'kedusha rishona." It's talking about the Mikdash here. "B'kedusha rishona shekidsha Shlomo, shehu kidesh ha'azara v'Yerushalayim." In other words, there's Kedusha of the Azara and Yerushalayim, but we saw in the Mishnayot that the level of Kedusha is different. In other words, even though they both stem from that root of Shechina, it doesn't mean that all the Kedushot are on the same level. Similarly, when you extend the Kedusha from Yerushalayim to the rest of Eretz Yisrael, it's an extension of the roots, but it doesn't equate the level of Kedusha. Okay? And that's what we saw in the Mishnayot in Keli. Okay, we don't have much time, but being that some of these questions were asked, let's relate to the Kesef Mishnah. I didn't bring it here, and he asks some questions on this Rambam. If Chazaka creates an eternal Kedusha, then why wasn't Chazaka also applicable in Beit Rishon? After they conquered, they also settled. They were machzik the land. So why not continue the Kedusha after the destruction? Secondly, he asks, Okay, the second question we have basically answered already, and that his second question is the question of what is that unique strength of Kedushat Chazaka. So that we answered already. The first question, the answer offered for that is that we can't just pile one form of Kedusha over another form of Kedusha. There was a need to sanctify Eretz Yisrael through the conquering, because they didn't settle immediately in all of Eretz Yisrael. So that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael was created by the conquering. Once that Kedusha exists, then another factor doesn't come into action. Certainly, if we understand it, as we suggested, that there are other aspects of creating that Kedushat Chazaka. It's not just the residing. It's either based on the agreement of the sovereign powers of the world, that didn't exist in all of Beit Rishon, or the idea of extending the Kedushat HaShechina. Maybe it could have been done, but it wasn't done, and therefore the Kedushat Chazaka would not have applied during Beit Rishon.
You can't get Kedusha, have Shalom add Kedusha to Yerushalayim during the first five.
Because it's a different Kedusha. Because it's a different Kedusha. He couldn't create the Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, the Rabbi. That wouldn't. What he created was a unique Kedusha of Mikdash in Yerushalayim. Okay, in the 2 minutes we have, I'll end with one more point. We have a halacha, and that you'll see on the bottom of the last page, and there was simply I must have pressed something incorrectly, and it's a little messed up there. A halacha in reference to Kriya, when seeing cities at time of destruction. So the Shulchan Aruch brings, Haro'eh arei Yehuda bechorbanam, Omer, I ignore the Magen Avraham at the moment, arei kodsheh chayu midbar v'korea. When he sees arei Yehuda, the walled cities of Yehuda, then he says, arei kodsheh chayu midbar, the cities of your sanctity, the sanctified cities, right? We said they're sanctified, reference to Eretz Yisrael, have become like a desert, they're desolate, and then he does Kriya. And similarly, there's Haro'eh Yerushalayim b'churbana, the next halacha. Haro'eh Yerushalayim b'churbana, Omer Tzion hayta midbar shomema, ukshero'eh Beit HaMikdash, Omer Beit Kodshenu v'tifartenu. And each is a separate Kriya. Okay? So again, first of all, we see that relative aspect of Kedusha. I tore for Ir Mukefet Choma, for a walled city, but when I see Yerushalayim, there's a greater destruction. When I see the Makom HaMikdash, there's even a greater destruction, and I tear again, without getting into the details. The Magen Avraham, in reference to Arei Mukafot Choma, says Bechurbanan, and that's the third line there, Bechurbanan, Af al pi sheyoshvim bahem Yisrael, kivan sha'umot moshlim alehem mikrei churban. In other words, even if Jews are living in those walled cities, but since the sovereignty is a sovereignty of non-Jews, there's a requirement of Kriya. And what about when there is a sovereignty of Jews, as we Baruch Hashem have today? Most poskim say that halacha does not apply today, because the Kriya of Arei Choma is an expression of the loss of sovereignty. Most poskim accept the Magen Avraham, and therefore say there's no Kriya, even if we could identify Arei Choma today. In complete opposition, in reference to Mikdash, most poskim, there are a few who say differently, or as Schechter calls them, Rabbanim Tzirim, but there are those who think differently, but most poskim hold that even though there is Jewish sovereignty, we are to tear Kriya when seeing the Makom HaMikdash because of the element of the destruction of Mikdash, the inability to function in Avodat Hashem in the proper level.
It's also not in our hands.
Let's assume it is. Okay?
No,
I said,
big assumption.
let's assume it is.
It requires
Technically speaking, we could do it. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Har HaBayit B'Yadeinu was declared. Okay.
Yeah,
Is it fulfilled? Do we follow? It's a different question. Okay. What about Yerushalayim?
Thank you, Moshe.
What happens to Yerushalayim? Here we find differing opinions. And maybe both things actually play in reference to Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, as we saw, is an extension of Mikdash as far as its Kedusha, because it's part of the Avodat HaKorbanot. And therefore, from that point of view, Yerushalayim does require Kriya. But Yerushalayim also has a different element to it. Yerushalayim is the capital. Where did Malchei Beit David put themselves? Where did David HaMelech already, before he even built the Mikdash?
Yerushalayim.
Puts himself in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the symbol of Jewish sovereignty.
Because he actually bought it.
And in that sense, from that perspective, thank God we have sovereignty. So therefore,
Act like it.
the question is, what do we see as the primary aspect of Yerushalayim? Or maybe we can suggest both things exist, and there is no need for Kriya because of sovereignty, but there's still a need for Kriya because of Mikdash. The idea, I'll just end with that, the idea of the two aspects of Yerushalayim we express every day 3 times a day in Shemona Esrei. Vil Yerushalayim ircha berachamim tashuv. And what's the next bracha? It's Semach David Avdecha Me'at Tzmiach, which is in reference to Yerushalayim as well. In other words, there are two aspects. There is the aspect of Yerushalayim in its sanctity, in its Kedusha Mikdash, and there's Semach David Avdecha, the Melucha. And before I let you go, regardless of the shiur, okay, I just wanted to make a point of the fact that basically as of yesterday, and it will be focused next week, Torah Mitzion is running its annual fundraiser. Torah Mitzion is an organization some of you encountered when you were yet in Chutz La'aretz and saw for your own selves the impact and the importance of bringing the flavor of Eretz Yisrael, the Torah of Eretz Yisrael, to people in Chutz La'aretz. But also in other areas, it's dealt with giving shiurim and bringing Torah to Jews throughout the world, some through video conferencing for years already. This program, and I can attest to it because I was involved at the time, was established through Torah Mitzion. This is an organization that truly works to further Torah, to further the love of Am Yisrael amongst Jews. And the more you can contribute, the more you will be helping this very important mission.
Does the Jewish population make a difference?
let's say you have Jewish sovereignty in an area of, let's say, arguably Yerushalayim. I'm not getting too worried about where Yerushalayim are, which is majority majority of non-Jewish population. Does that mean that?
As you're saying, what happens? We have sovereignty, but not
population,
but not Jewish population.
And then reverse way, in the first place, that makes what actually what the question of Yerushalayim is. When we think about Yerushalayim, the only part that was really destroyed was what the inside. But Ramat Rachel was never touched. And then
there was anything in Ramat Rachel.
There was because that's the Ministry of Capital, and we found. I actually it was a whole. They actually checked the whole thing. There was a whole archaeology